Thanks everyone for joining us. We're delighted that you're here. We'll be getting going in about 30 seconds. Feel free to introduce yourself using the chat box. It's great that you're here. As people continue to enter the large room, I'll encourage everyone to use the chat box to introduce yourselves to everybody else in the room. Just tell us your name and which organization you're with, and we'll be getting going very, very shortly. We had terrific response to registration for today's webinar, and we're absolutely delighted that you have all signed up to join us. I guess it's the discussion for the times, is it not? Okay, I think we're just about ready to get going. And as we are starting with introductions, we'll still be admitting people into the big room. And again, feel free to introduce yourself using the chat box. Again, my name is Catherine Carlton. I'm Executive Director of Orchestras Canada, Orchestre Canada, and it is my complete delight to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the first in a 2-webinar series. This one, our expert guest is Chris Walroth, who is the production manager of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. Chris has been with the TSO, I think he was just in the middle of his 22nd season when COVID hit, so he's not sure if that counts as a full 22nd season. I'd say it does. Chris has a long background in the theater and special events prior to his arrival at the TSO. He is part of that amazing team of people that we all appreciate so much, who make sure, quite simply, that things work backstage and on stage so that the art can happen. And Chris is renowned, I think, in the industry across Canada for his generosity and for his willingness to share what he knows. And he is, okay, we've got someone who's not muted. If you aren't muted, you should be, and you can find the mute box. If you toggle over your photograph, you can hit mute. Okay, so we'll just make sure that everyone's muted and that you can use the chat box to be able to communicate with us and let us know if you've got any issues hearing things, any issues seeing things, and we'll address that right away. So, continuing with my introduction of Chris Walroth of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, we've been talking to Chris on and off throughout the pandemic, as has the group of people who have been working on production and operation issues for Canadian orchestras, and it became abundantly clear to us that this was a conversation that needed to happen now. We've got enough information from legislators and public health officials to understand a little bit of the territory that we're currently operating in, and consequently, we felt that it was time to start the conversation with detail about what a safe reopening might potentially look like in current conditions. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris Walroth from the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. Chris, unmute yourself and over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Let me just get my slide deck. Catherine, I assume everybody's seeing the slides here. Good afternoon, all. Thank you for attending. Veuillez m'excuser pour ne pas parler français. Orchestras Canada will be making this slide deck with the links available after the presentation. The slide deck is available now, translated to French, for those of you who would like to get that and follow along. Throughout the presentation, you'll see links in my slides underlined in green, which you can use after the presentation to see relevant articles for further research. And I'm going to try and limit my speaking to about 25 minutes today, and that should give us plenty of time for questions at the end. So Catherine invited me to speak to you today to help Orchestras Canada begin to answer the one simple question many of you have been asking. Tell me what to do. Unfortunately, I'm here to tell you we can't exactly do that. We can't give you a step-by-step how to operate reasonably when opening your orchestra during a global pandemic. We can offer some guidance, but what every orchestra has in common is that we're all a little bit different. I have never seen two orchestras that operate exactly the same way, which frankly surprises me, considering we mostly play the top of the pops of the past 300 years, and we're dressed like we're going to dinner at Downton Abbey while we're doing it. What we have to do is create our own plans based on our local situation. We need to follow our municipal, provincial, and federal guidelines, and I deliberately put the three of those in that order. As a legal entity, your organization needs to follow federal and provincial labor law, health and safety guidelines, and specific COVID-19 measures. And by the way, if any of you have volunteer musicians or rely on volunteer staff to help you out, volunteers should be considered workers for health and safety reasons. Legally, this is going to vary by province, but when you're assessing a situation to determine if there's a worker-employer relationship, three conditions need to be met. One, the organization requests the volunteer's participation. Two, the organization organizes the volunteer's activities. And three, the volunteer provides a service to the organization. Our local health units are the primary agencies that we need to satisfy with our plan. Local government and regional public health, in most cases, will have the jurisdiction to enforce whatever guidance is in place. And in my opinion, unless the event leads to a high-profile outbreak, the province is just going to be too busy to enforce or care about what each individual organization does. That's not to say you can ignore the federal or provincial guidelines. And what's allowed varies greatly by jurisdiction. For example, Ontario, on the 15th of July, 2020, said that plexiglass or some other impermeable barrier is required between the audience and singers, as well as players of brass or wind instruments. Then the City of Toronto, 2 weeks later, on the 29th of July, said singers and players of brass or wind instruments must be separated from any spectators by at least 2 meters or by an impermeable barrier, i.e. plexiglass. And now this past Monday, the City of Toronto confirmed with Orchestras Canada that they'd be updating their guidance to be completely consistent with the province. And they've taken away that little or scenario for us. What we've been doing for the last 155 days since the shutdown on March 12th, has been described as racing to a start line that does not yet exist. Well, now, most of us have a start line at some definite time in the future, but the line keeps moving. We have just one chance to get it right when it comes to reopening, and that means letting the science guide us. That quote is from Mary McCall of Actors Equity. What makes it hard to try and follow Mary's guidance there is that the science has not caught up yet. The WHO has been tracking published medical studies about COVID-19. As of mid-June, 2 months ago, more than 22,000 papers on the virus have been published, and more than 2,000 trials were underway. That's an enormous amount of information coming out before peer review, and that is a problem. It's not all verified science yet, and there's a lot that we still don't know. So I'm asking you, as you're working on what to do, avoid the breaking news scenarios. You're going to hear a lot. You've probably heard a lot. Some orchestra did a study somewhere, and they did a thing with a thing on a stage or in a lab, and it showed so-and-so. That's all very preliminary work. Many bits of it are encouraging, but it's not particularly useful until it's been peer reviewed. Remember, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So what are we really trying to achieve when we reopen? What the health units are concerned with, their only concern is stopping the spread of COVID-19. So let's review for a minute, how does it spread? This image from the City of Toronto Public Health covers most of the main points. Mainly, the virus spreads from close contact. We've all heard these things land on surfaces, so clean surfaces, wash your hands, don't touch your face. People are most contagious when they're sick and for the 48 hours before they show symptoms. So stay at home, self-isolate if you're sick, keep your distance in common areas, and masks or face coverings can help protect you and others. That's the basics, but the more I read this, the more contradictions I see. And when we're dealing with infection control for COVID-19, that's all too common. So how do we do this? First, I think respect and understanding is going to be absolutely critical as you bring everyone back together. I'm already seeing two behaviors coming from performers and staff. We're all equally eager to return to normal as soon as possible, and absolutely terrified that resuming activity will bring the virus home to us and our families. Each individual's circumstances and vulnerabilities are different. Open communication and a strong framework for reopening with options will allow workers to decide if return to work poses an unreasonable risk. To do that, we all need a written, formal business continuity plan specific to this pandemic. All planners, organizers, operators, and permit holders of events and gatherings, regardless of the purpose and size, have a responsibility to assess the risks and implement measures to reduce the risk of infection among all those who participate, including staff, performers, volunteers, and attendees. Now, this would be a good time for me to mention to you that the second webinar in this series, led by Janet Sellery on Thursday, September 10th, will give you lots of specific guidance for planning and risk assessment. And once you have a plan, you're going to need to communicate it early and often with all your stakeholders. So where do you start? Where do you make a plan? If you're lucky enough to work in a professional venue, a place that rents out for live performance, then they're going to have some sort of a plan you can start from. Even if you're using a school gymnasium, that venue will have some sort of a reopening plan. When you're in that venue, you'll be following their plan, their rules, with add-ons custom to our type of performance. For those customizations, you can get some good guidance from several places. The Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety has very good guidance in general about keeping workers safe during COVID-19. The Event Safety Alliance has the granddaddy of all reopening guides, and there's a lot in that one to unpack. I really recommend you read through it in a comfy chair with a relaxing beverage, then set it aside and come back to it as your plan develops. You don't necessarily have to make something that complex, but it'll open your eyes to which issues you need to focus on. The AFM and the Federation of International Musicians have specific guidance for orchestra musicians. And Orchestras Canada is also maintaining a great repository of up-to-date information for all of us. I wanted you to see this image, which I got originally from the Toronto Musicians Association website. I couldn't find that page when I went back to look for it to link to it here, but I wanted you to see it if, especially like me, you're feeling how absurd this situation is. It's also a good chance for me to pause and grab a sip of water, and I'll ask if there are any questions at this point. So Catherine or Royden or Sarah, do we have anything we'd like to talk about at this point?
Okay, why don't we just take a little bit of a pause. We've encouraged people to enter questions into the chat box, but we don't have Anything in here now? Oh, something's coming in. Nope, just praise for your measured presentation. Those stentorian tones and clear diction, albeit wretched French accent.
Yes, absolutely wretched French accent. My apologies again. All right, well, in that case, I'll carry on.
Great, but I will
So,
encourage people, if you have questions as Chris is going, feel free to use the chat box as we go. If he answers the questions before there's the next break, we'll glide over them. But if there are additional questions, we'll roll with them at the next break. Thanks, Chris. Carry on.
okay, so we'll come back with some good news. The good news is that there are some best practices emerging. We know that successful infection by COVID-19 is a product of exposure to the virus times the time you're exposed. And longer contact between people increases the risk of transmission. That's basic to most infectious disease. It also appears that being indoors increases the risk of transmission. So how do we cope with this? Well, we slow the process down, we work with less people, and we take longer to do the job. There are ways to cope with those two higher risks, working in smaller groups and limiting interaction between groups. It means that one symptomatic person does not mandate isolating the entire larger group. Also, you need to allow only mission-critical people into any area until all public health restrictions are lifted. So consider things that you're doing now that are maybe not critical. If you have volunteers coming in to set up tea and cookies for the orchestra break, perhaps you should just cut that out entirely. If you have 4 or 5 people who regularly come in and set up chairs and stands for the orchestra before rehearsal, maybe pare that down to 2 people and have them work longer, but a different 2 people put everything away afterwards, so those 2 groups never intermingle. We need to look at every aspect of rehearsal and performance practice to limit interactions between musicians, support staff, as well as each other. And I'll talk about more specifics of that in a couple of minutes. There are some best practices around gathering. First, all group activities, where possible, should be monitored by an infection control supervisor. Someone whose sole job is to make sure your safety and COVID-19 protocols are followed. Someone with the authority to enforce your plan, someone to implement and document symptom screening, someone with the resources and knowledge to deal with the symptomatic worker. Ideally, this should be a person with some medical background or training. We really need to enforce a strict symptom screening protocol prior to arriving at any group activity. And we need to document that screening for contact tracing should someone prove to be positive for COVID-19. We need to discourage shaking hands, hugging, any other physical contact, avoid it all. Frequent hand washing should be encouraged, and you may need to provide additional supplies for this to make sure it's happening with everyone. PPE, personal protection equipment, specifically face masks, should be mandatory for everyone until they're seated in place on stage ready to play. Backstage warm-up procedures should be discussed and re-examined. In all those areas, you're looking for choke points, places where close contact can't be avoided. Look for touch points, physical contact between multiple people and objects. Those are 2 big critical transmission areas to consider. And finally, any equipment not supplied by the performer must be clean and disinfected prior to use. And please note, cleaning and disinfecting are 2 different things. You cannot disinfect a dirty surface because the virus hides in the dirt. You should also know that most disinfectants that work against COVID-19 will damage wood finishes. We've been talking to our harp maker, Lyon and Healy, for example. They say the strings, bow brand, used on most harps are fine. You can disinfect them with a simple wipe. Any of the commercial wipes on the market that will work against COVID-19 are perfectly good on those strings. However, any of those commercial wipes will likely damage the wood finish of the harp. So their recommendation is isolate the instrument so that only the harp player ever has to touch the instrument. There are some further best practices for orchestras, digging in a little deeper. Sharing instruments, microphones, musical scores, sheet music, any other items should be avoided. Every musician should have their own designated stand and chair, and distance from each other by at least the current recommended minimum standard. Musicians should bring their own instruments, sheet music, and accessories to the stage to avoid contamination. And wind and brass musicians must clean up and remove and dispose of their own condensate. Puppy pads can be a practical disposal solution for this, although that will get expensive over time. Be sure to include enough containers to dispose of all the gloves, masks, and puppy pads that you might generate over the course of a service. We often forget that wherever great art is made, there's a massive amount of garbage produced as a byproduct. And one more thing, musicians should arrive dressed for the performance. You want to avoid the crowding in the backstage dressing rooms, generally smaller confined areas and with poorer ventilation. There are ways we can design our concert flow to eliminate contact between staff and musicians. We don't do changes of stage setup between works. Design everything to work within one setup. No rolling the piano on and off stage and having a couple of stagehands shuffle chairs and music stands. Musicians may come and go if it's practical between works, but musicians shouldn't be allowed to sit in another person's location until that location has been completely disinfected. Having a concert with no intermission reduces interaction and the need for washroom use for your musicians and also for your audience. Now, bringing an audience back safely deserves its own separate webinar, and I'm sure the staff of Orchestras Canada will have something to say about that in the very near future. Meanwhile, a few things you can start thinking about. No paper tickets or paper programs, contactless entry, multiple entry points, staggered entry times, and ticket scanning. And advanced ticket sales by section, not by seat, is important to remain adaptable to changing distance guidelines. A couple of final thoughts before we get to questions. Communicating and enforcing new protocols will be among the most challenging tasks we face. We all know orchestras are very traditional businesses. Musicians and staff tend to have a high level of entitlement. Many don't bother to read or understand the fairly simple directives we sent them in the pre-COVID days. Things like timed entrance and exit, new backstage distancing protocols, limits to the number of people in the building. All these things need to be strictly enforced in a way that we've never had to do before. Teaching the new process and training for the new protocols is going to be absolutely critical. As a manager, you need to organize your usual stuff now so that you can focus on the new stuff when we get into the bigger bit, the busy thing where you're actually reopening. Anything you can do at this very moment to advance your work or streamline your workflow, do it now. Get organized and get everything in place so that you can concentrate on the changes, because changes are going to happen. You're also going to need to document everything you do more than ever before, especially for contact tracing, for change of contact. You're going to be communicating early and often with your stakeholders. And you're also going to be holding information that potentially has privacy concerns, symptom screening, that sort of thing. So you need to secure that information and plan how and when it can be safely destroyed when you no longer need it. And finally, you need to model the behavior you want to see. And I heard a great example of this just yesterday. Wisconsin's Department of Natural Resources has mandated all their staff must wear masks even when on a Zoom meeting from home. Wearing masks when video conferencing with external partners sets an example. It sets the bar. Another way you can model the behavior you want to see is if you're not necessary for a particular event, then you shouldn't be there. You should leave it in someone else's hands. You should work with that smaller group concept that we talked about earlier. Now, as a follow-up, these slides will be available after the presentation, as Catherine mentioned before. If I don't get to your question today, you can send me an email at the email address on this slide. We also have a Facebook group for orchestra production people and a bi-weekly Zoom call Wednesdays at 3:30 to discuss the latest developments. And anyone who's involved with production of the orchestra is welcome to join us. There's also a link here to the International Musicians Symphonic Services Division. They have some good information on their thoughts on COVID-19. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank Jeffrey Kernow, the Associate Principal Trumpet of the Philadelphia Orchestra, for that amazing walk-in image that we used, the Monopoly cartoon that you saw as my presentation was starting. I'd like to thank Catherine Carlton for the invitation to talk to you today, Sarah Thompson and Dr. Royden C. for listening to my rehearsals and editing my spelling and grammar, helping me put this whole thing together. And finally, a reminder, please mark your calendars and be sure to tune in for part 2 of the webinar series with Janet Sellery on September 10th. That's the formal part of my presentation, and I'll just grab a sip of water and take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. We've had a number of questions come in, and looking forward to your thoughts on what's come in here. And if other people in the crowd also have things that they want to add, again, we can use the chat box for that. So first question, and it's a good one, comes in from Roland Wilk, who's asking, I'm really interested to know what impermeable barrier actually means. To be impermeable, it would need to be floor to ceiling. Is that truly what the intention is? Care to comment, Chris? You'll need to unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, I would love to comment. And I'll try not to make this one take up the entire rest of our time here. I really don't know what they had in mind, and I almost wish that they had done what Alberta initially did, which was to say just no brass, no woodwinds, no singing, period. As what I've seen a few people implementing, and this is still very early, is as long as the barrier is between the musician and the audience member, even I've seen in some instances sort of from the waist up to a few feet above the head, a barrier, in a club venue sort of thing. As long as that is between the musician's mouth, their COVID spreader, and the audience, that seems to be acceptable. We all initially thought of plexiglass, and then some of us are thinking that that's not practical for a lot of reasons, including it will be extremely difficult for the orchestra members to hear each other. The one way we could meet the guidance is to build a giant plexiglass wall on the front edge of our stages, but that does nothing to protect our orchestra members from each other. It does nothing to protect our string players from our wind and brass players, for example. So the more practical solution is to put the plexiglass in front of the wind players, but then the wind players are almost certainly not going to be able to hear the string players, and the whole ensemble of the orchestra is going to fall apart. So I'm thinking we need to do things when the orchestra comes back, like test clear shower curtains on rails, ground supported, and as long as it's tall enough to be a barricade between the audience and where the musician is, and as long as we seam the sides somehow, even with clear tape, so it's a solid barrier across, it will at least pass more sound through, and there's a better chance of my musicians being able to hear each other. The whole thing has really stymied me. I look at my venue, Roy Thompson Hall in Toronto, and with a gathering limit of only 50 people, I can start 30 feet back from the stage and seat 50 people on the main floor. I doubt there's any chance of respiratory droplets getting to the audience that far back in the hall, but I'm still required by the Ontario guidance to build an impermeable barrier between my orchestra and my audience. So it's in some ways beyond my reckoning as to how they did it. I hope it helps, but I can't explain what they were thinking when they wrote it.
Okay, well, I will simply state that this question has been raised by a number of people in terms of the practicalities of how to accomplish this and how precisely it's going to work. And I'll say that there is some advocacy currently being done to the province around this and certain other aspects of the regulations. And I think, you know, it may be that there will be some positive response in that regard. Next great question.
Sorry, if
Yeah.
I could just, one little thing for follow-up, where I think at least we have an advantage is we have a little bit of time until our orchestra gathers together again. And so that may allow the situation to develop a little more, but also, while we're all looking for opportunities to get some revenue during this time period, it's doubtful that 50 people gathering in an auditorium of any sort is going to generate enough revenue to pay for that service. So I think we're going to have to wait a little bit until where we are anyway, the gathering limit expands a bit before we're seriously looking at ticketed events in any significant way.
Thank you. I think that's another key point. Next question comes from Anne Malochik, and Anne is asking if the venue has prepared a business continuity plan, does that cover the orchestra? Does that suffice for the orchestra? Is the orchestra off the hook?
Not entirely, in my view. Our venue came up with an incredibly detailed first stage plan, which has nothing to do with bringing audience in and everything to do with bringing performers in. Our venue is initially thought they would be able to reopen essentially as a recording studio for performers. And we're lucky to have the infrastructure in place with multiple cameras and mixing consoles and switching and basically all the outboard gear you need to stream a live event to the internet. So the initial thought of our venue was we're going to open but not have any audience. So the plan that they developed and shared with us was incredibly detailed, treated the performers generally. Because our venue, we're the principal tenant, so they're used to orchestras. In fact, the first thing they told me about their plan was your orchestra members are not going to be allowed to dump their spit valves on our stage anymore. period, end of story, forevermore. So they had some accommodation for the specifics of orchestra performance, but there was some gaps in what they put together. So you need to look at their plan and how you work and decide if there's something missing. If you're only in their venue for every service, then you're pretty close to covered. And that plan, typically, I think if it's approved by your local health department, if your venue has a plan approved by the local health department, you're covered from that respect, unless you're doing something outside of what's in the plan. You know, for example, our venue as well said we're decommissioning all the dressing rooms backstage. All performers have to arrive dressed for the performance. We're decommissioning the lounges. We're decommissioning the water fountains. If anyone needs water, you have to bring your own water. All of that sort of thing was incredibly detailed and carefully thought out. Not all venues may be doing that. So it will help, but it might not be a complete solution for you.
Great. So clear advice then to review it and do a bit of a risk assessment in terms of what you know about the needs of your orchestra, the structure of your orchestra, the kind of activity that you're involved in, just to ensure that it's as complete as you feel it should be to manage your own risks. Just to confirm for Dorothy Ward, who asked, so we do have to have impenetrable barriers even if we're distant from our audience? And the short answer is yes. Physical distancing is not one of the things that's referenced with respect to wind players, brass players, and singing. The impermeable or the impenetrable barriers, the impermeable barriers are the one thing that the provincial regulations in Ontario reference. Now we've got a little bit of, okay, I'm going to scroll down because we've got rather a lot of questions here. I've got one from Leanne Desrochers, who's asking about a potential order of operations to send out a survey to subscribers to gauge their comfort on the procedures involved in holding an indoor concert. She's wondering, and we can perhaps take this offline after, if suitable. Should we do this before we plan the events, or once we've got a solid event planned in a very detailed scenario? They're looking to do something simple that will help them understand the appetite of their patrons to return, given the requirements.
I think the more research you can do, the better, and the more you know and understand your participants, the better. I would keep it very simple and try and keep it to 4 or 5 questions. It's going to vary depending on your patron, how your patrons travel to your event. Are they comfortable, you know, traveling to the event on transit, if that's a factor, or versus driving? Are they willing to do a symptom check pre-arrival? You could say that we're planning, or we're thinking of requesting all patrons to wear masks until they're seated in the auditorium for the performance. We're going to be asking you to let us know if you're block booking a group of 6 tickets, that all 6 of those people confirm they're of the same household or to the same group or the same bubble, depending on how your particular jurisdiction lays it out. But I think answering some of those questions can really help inform us of what we need to accommodate in our plan.
Absolutely, and I would suggest that doing the proposal around shorter concerts and no intermission. Are they comfortable with that? Are they comfortable with arriving well ahead of the time in order that the seating in the auditorium can be done in an orderly way so that people are not crashing into one another? I mean, I suppose there's a few different options.
There's one more thing on that, actually, that you probably should research before investing in. One thing a lot of orchestras are talking about is streaming concerts and offering ticket holders the ability to watch from home on a live screen that's behind a paywall. So when you buy your ticket to this concert, you can either show up in person with your ticket, or you can watch it on over the internet by entering this code and this however the service works to restrict people's entry. And is that of interest to people? And if it is of interest to people, how and what sort of a device would they view it on? Are most of our people capable of viewing it on their 55-inch television with surround sound, or are they going to be huddled around their iPad or their phone at home watching the concert? I think it's going to be important in the early days of inviting our audience to come back to acknowledge they will have the same issues that our orchestra and our staff has, coming back, very much wanting to do so, but also concerned about transmission of the virus. So offering people an option to watch from home, even if at the last minute they just say, oh, look, I've had a bad day, case count has been up in my area in the last 2 or 3 days, I just don't feel comfortable going downtown and listening to the symphony, while you can still get the symphony at home because you're a ticket buyer. That sort of thing as well.
Great. Okay. Next question that may not be in your wheelhouse, Chris, because it's another front of house question. Any thoughts on how different organizations might manage no paper programs, particularly if it's an audience that doesn't necessarily use devices? What's the smart talk about that?
That is really out of my wheelhouse. I know that there are ways you can rent devices, but that may get you into costs that you're not able to add to the already growing expense items for dealing with COVID. Audiovisual companies, for example, will rent a suite of iPads that you could offer to patrons as they come into the venue, and you'd have to disinfect them beforehand, charge them afterwards, that sort of thing. You could also look at doing program notes, projecting on a screen over the orchestra or something like that, in the same way that we do subtitles and surtitles. You could put up a little bit of basic information about the program and program credits that way.
Sure. And there's certainly also conductors who, or someone in the orchestra potentially, who could deliver a few brief atmospheric thoughts, and all part of sort of changing the atmosphere in the concert hall, given the idea of shorter concerts.
Yeah.
And pushing the idea that we're all in this together. Let's roll on to the next one. This one comes from Helen Graham. Do we see the province of Ontario increasing the 50-person limit for indoor gatherings anytime soon?
Oh, I hope so. But I'm really not sure that we're going to get there for long before the potential for a second wave comes in. I think this fall is going to be a really difficult time for all of us. I can easily see, just with the seasonal flu and the wave of COVID going up and down, we've been doing really well. We've been doing incredibly well in Canada. Ontario generally has done fairly well, although we have a fairly high case count in this province. But I think the fact that we've been doing so well is based on the public health units taking a very hard line on shutting things down so the virus doesn't spread. And they will probably continue to do that. So if the case count starts to rise in the fall, then we're going to see rolling back some of the stage 3 advantages we have right now. And I think that applies right across the country. There is to a certain extent, there's a building desire and need to get back to normal, but I think that the governments are still quite actively looking at safety first, and if we have to close the door again to keep the majority of people safe, we're going to do that.
Okay. Next question comes from Eric from the Edmonton Symphony, and he's wondering what the conversation is around rehearsals. Is there a recommended process? No break, shorter rehearsal time, any of those sorts of things? Not asking you to reveal trade secrets, but I know that there's an ongoing negotiation, or at least there was.
Yeah. There was. The work rules for us have changed a little bit. We basically have a couple of different classifications now. There are some things we can do that are outside of the traditional work rules with smaller groups of musicians, and I don't think I can say any more than that. But generally, yes, best practice is to gather groups together for shorter, more intense periods of time, and then get them out and on their way again. One of the things we're looking at with smaller group activities is being able at times to divide the orchestra up into quartets and quintets and smaller chamber-sized groups. And one of the things around that is to try and keep that group intact. So if these 5 players are a wind quintet, then they should always perform together as their quintet, and another group of 5 wind players perform as a different quintet. And they shouldn't cross over even when you're bringing a larger orchestra together, if distancing allows you to do that. Traditionally for us, associate principal winds would play the first half of the concert, and then the principal players would come in and take over and play the second half of the concert. That's more exposure of people to where other people have been sitting, which we don't want to do. It's also exposure to between those groups of people. So we want to keep, if we're working in smaller orchestras, we want to keep set A of winds as separate from set B of winds as possible.
So in essence, it's like the Atlantic bubble of the orchestra.
Exactly.
You hang with the people in your bubble, and there's not a lot of crossover or design lack of crossover
Yes.
when it's the same room, same gear. Okay.
In all instances, because if you think about it, even if in the next week we find a way to bring 50 musicians together on the stage, if one of those 50 musicians happens to test positive for COVID because they picked it up when they were at their local drugstore or shopping or something, you're going to have to isolate all 50 of those musicians, and you're going to lose every potential smaller group that any of those 50 musicians are participating in, because they may have done something between the time that infected person was discovered. They may have had contact with their group. So you end up losing a lot more people to an isolation situation if you allow crossover between the groups.
Okay, next question, and again, Chris, this may lead to another conversation with other experts in the field, but there's a question from Victoria. Has anyone developed best practices for sheet music distribution, given the idea that everyone's going to need to have their own part, that they're going to be the ones who are touching their music and no one else is touching it, or else it's been isolated? Copyright restrictions limit the ability to distribute scans of some works. Are you able to speak about any of the conversations that are going on around that?
Sure. I can tell you that we did one little project back in the end of June, just before the orchestra went on their scheduled summer contract hiatus. And it was a recording project with 3 quintets worth of musicians that were playing pieces that we were going to mix together, plus individual standalone pieces for each of a wind, brass, and string quintet. And for that event, we had the music prepared early. The librarians placed the music in individual folders for each musician, and they left them in the folder for 4 days or something like that, and then they made them available for pickup at the stage door of Roy Thompson Hall. So the musician, once they got that music, it had been sitting in an envelope for 4 days. Chance was very good that any virus that may have been transmitted was no longer active. And then the music became completely the musician's responsibility to bring to and from every service, to put on the stand, to take off the stand. If they forgot their music, it's on to them to solve it, sort of thing. This may not be practical when we start churning over more music more rapidly. In some cases, some of the musicians chose to ask for a PDF copy that they could use on their device, their iPad, or whatever. That's going to vary depending on the work, the copyright holder, that sort of thing. But I'm seeing a lot of our musicians, when they do their own chamber music work, working almost exclusively from iPads. So a lot of our orchestra has the ability and the knowledge of how to do that. It's a matter of sometimes convincing the copyright holders that we're going to make a PDF of this version, we're going to give it to the musician, and they promise they're going to destroy it afterwards. It's a negotiation thing.
Right. So hearing a strong role for the librarian in the conversations with the publishers and other copyright holders. A note here, we didn't hear you mention ventilation. Is there a reason for that? Or
Sorry, can you say that again?
we didn't hear you mention ventilation.
Yeah, that's a huge subject. And I think it's an important one, but it's an area where there's still conflicting information. If I were to flip back through to that slide I showed you all of the City of Toronto guidance for COVID-19, there's a specific thing in there that says, in effect, COVID it's not been proven that COVID travels through ventilation systems. So that's not a concern. And I think what they're talking about specifically in that instance is where you have a rooming house or an apartment complex situation where there's a central HVAC system. Someone who's in one part of the building is not going to infect someone who's in another part of the building. My reading on COVID-19 is that air exchange is critical, as much outdoor fresh air as possible, and advanced filtration if you can get it. When you're working with a smaller group, the larger the room, being outside is critical. So I think ventilation certainly has a role to play, but it's one of those places where there have been some studies, but the health departments are not stressing the ventilation angle. But getting back to what someone spoke to about rehearsals, that's a prime reason why we want to reduce the amount of time in rehearsal together. We want to do an intense hour or 90-minute rehearsal and then clear people out to allow the HVAC system to cycle and do a complete air exchange in the room.
Right. I think the University of Colorado at Boulder study is recommending rehearsals of 45 minutes max at this point, but you know, it is an evolving science. So I'm just going to roll on. We've got 5 minutes and 33 new messages that I haven't yet scrolled up on my screen. There is some really good information exchange back and forth, and information about devices that are available. We're going to save the chat, and we will include that in the notes on this session. But I think a really let me just pose a question to you, Chris, that came in from Judy Burns, who says, how long is it going to take to implement all these changes, and when are you planning to come back on stage?
Good question. Well, we have the orchestra back under contract in the middle of September. So we're about a month out from having 90 musicians looking for something to do. So the bottom line is that's our moving target, and we are still trying to figure out the details of exactly what that's going to look like. How much of that is going to be smaller individual or smaller group projects, more like the work that you've seen our orchestra do from the 12th of March through till the end of June, and what is going to actually be practical to gather 30, 40, 50 musicians together somewhere on a stage and actually have them perform something. My personal opinion is initially, if we're gathering the orchestra together, it might not be so much a ticketed event when we're still stuck with 50 people indoors. It might be more of a thank you concert for some of our more generous sponsors and donors. We've seen that in a lot of the European orchestras as they've been coming back. Their first concerts, they've limited the number of people attending, and they've done it by invitation only as a thank you to
We've
their
also
most
seen
loyal
that
patrons.
in the province of Quebec. There was a sample concert done at the Maison Symphonique by the Orchestre de la Gora for, I think, 50 frontline healthcare workers, and another concert just this last week in Quebec City at the Grand Théâtre, which was for 250, which is the mandated maximum in Quebec. But I think in different parts of the country, the math works more or less terribly to reassemble a full orchestra on stage for a live audience. And in Ontario at this point, with the limits of 50 people in the audience and the impermeable barrier situation, plus the symphony of 1,000 details necessary to make sure that everyone's safe, it's not going to be easy. I'm going to do a quick zip through what we have, and I'm going to boldly ask a question that I should have asked earlier, Chris. Would you be available to stay on for, let's say, another 15 minutes following the session?
Sure. Yep, absolutely.
And we'll commit to getting people responses after the fact if they need to sign off, but just to keep this rolling. So we've had someone who's posed the, really looking for a yes/no type response. Are barriers required during rehearsals without audience, or only during concerts with audience?
According to my reading of the Ontario guidance, they only care about a barrier between the performer and the audience. So there's no protection worker to worker in that guidance from my reading. So no, in a rehearsal, you don't need a barrier at all. However, if you have your string players very close to your woodwind players, as we would normally do, your string players and your woodwind players may feel very uncomfortable about playing without a significant distance or a barrier between them. And I've seen in some orchestras uh, just a couple of small plexiglass shields right in front of the flute player, just something that blocks this zone of the flute player from their colleagues around. So the flute player still has an opportunity to hear their colleagues, but anything direct coming out of the flute player's mouth gets caught by this shield that's only a couple of feet square.
Right. So although the regulations only stipulate separation between wind brass and singers and audience, there is a distinct possibility that if you want to ensure that you're taking care of your people, you are responsive to a request for barriers between wind and brass players and the remainder of the orchestra, as well as
Right,
considering social distancing on stage.
right. And if you check the links, the AF of M guidance has some things more geared to rehearsal studio, but I think they apply to rehearsals in general. They're recommending specific distancing for orchestras and extra distance for winds and brass. They're not, in their guidance, shields are not mandatory, but certainly distancing is part of what they're recommending for their people. And whether or not you're contracting members of the AF of M or others for your services, I think you can follow some of their guidance on how musicians should work responsibly and stay safe.
Yep. Okay. This one I think I'm going to take a stab at responding to it, and Chris, feel free to kick in if you've got more things to say. Any thoughts on how donors may react to no paper programs, which usually are an opportunity to advertise their generosity? And I'm going to take a stab at this and say, I think this entire crisis calls for a different modes and a reimagining, to use another famous word of these times, around donor recognition. And it could be everything from using screens at the venue to celebrate donors' generosity to different, as I say, different forms of donor recognition. And really getting into, do they really want to appear on a list in tiny type along with many other people, or would they appreciate a warm personal thank you phone call from a lead musician, music director, or board chair? That kind of thing, where I think it's time perhaps to adjust those expectations if having a paper program is really not in public health interests.
I agree with that 100%. And in fact, those sort of calls from the musician that you spoke about are part of the list of things that we're looking at being able to do, to have our orchestra members do, to make a contribution to the organization in times where we can't necessarily bring the whole 90 people together on the stage. So there's plenty of opportunity to connect a particular donor with a musician or with multiple musicians, have a conversation about the music, to say thank you, and that may be much more significant than whatever else, what we have been doing, as you say, their name in fine print on page 27 of the concert program.
Hey, a fabulous recommendation from Eric from the Edmonton Symphony, noting that the MOLA, the Major Orchestra Librarians Association, which is truly one of the great self-help organizations of this continent, in my view. I think it's mola.org, but we can double check that and put that into the comments. But the MOLA librarians are now having an extensive conversation about music handling. If you have access to the resources of MOLA, strongly recommended. It is a really good organization, and one of those places where that expertise that music librarians possess is in full display.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And just caution, is something you and I have talked about in past. MOLA also has some good guidance about copyright, but they're mainly focused on the US regulation.
Yes.
And Canada does have a slightly different system in some cases. What MOLA is recommending or requiring is not exactly the case in Canada.
Okay, absolutely. Oh, and I see it's been Devin has very kindly, it's mola-inc, as in mola-inc.org, appears to be the website. There's been a little bit of an exchange as well about the viability of masking for wind players. Various devices that I think we've all seen posted for comedic and other purposes on Facebook. Any sense, Chris, of whether that'll be something that the Toronto Symphony Orchestra would potentially be using, and how string players are feeling about wearing masks while playing?
Um, I think that we would make masks optional for string players. We would allow them, as I've seen many orchestras, to say if you want to leave your mask on, even though some of your colleagues in the winds and brass have to take your masks off, that's what you should do, whatever makes you comfortable. We're not going to force someone to mask once they're in their place on stage, and we're also not going to force you to take your mask off if you're not comfortable with it. The other items, the face shield, Catherine, I assume you've seen the clarinet in a bag.
I have seen the clarinet in a bag. I've also seen clarinets with bell nets on,
Yeah,
and I've seen masks that have been specially adapted with an opening around the embouchure for wind and brass players.
yeah. I would say we're open to all of that in terms of making our orchestra feel more comfortable. But none of that is a requirement of the current guidance in our jurisdiction anyway. I am hoping we'll continue to proceed with an abundance of caution and do whatever we can over and above the minimum. This might be a good point just to mention. I see the public health guidance that's come out kind of like the building code when you're constructing a house. It is the minimum acceptable standard for doing what it is you're doing. And a lot of good contractors will go above and beyond the building code by a certain amount. They have developed certain habits or certain procedures which take things to the next level in terms of safety, security, durability. So we can cruise along with that minimum guidance that public health has given us, or we can choose to go a little step above that and try and keep things a little safer for people. And the more studies that come out that confirm things, the more peer review there is of some of the initial research that'll guide us to things like nets on the bells and that sort of thing. There was a little exchange between a couple of friends of mine on social media a week or so ago, where someone challenged them to blow out a birthday candle using a trumpet. And I'm not a musician. I don't play an instrument. I would never attempt that at the best of times. But, you know, that's kind of where we're at. We're not sure. We don't know. Maybe we'll gather trumpet players and try and blow out candles one day to
I
see
think
how
that may
that
have
works.
been the initial air displacement tests that were undertaken in Germany back in May. We all saw the famous picture of the bassoonist with the puffs of smoke around their
Mm-hmm.
head. I'm just thinking that, you know, what seems to have come up in some of the more recent work has been where the various places that air is leaked. And in some cases, it's right around the embouchure. In other cases, it's coming out the bell. In other cases, such as woodwinds, it might be coming out open holes on the instruments. So it's not. I mean, I'm finding the whole thing fascinating in terms of what we imagine
Mhm. And,
are the sources of aerosols and what appears to be actually happening.
yeah, and I think I've been reading a few things that have said that face shields, as opposed to masks, offer far less protection. Um, there was one, I'm trying to recall the source of it, but there was one, almost a control study. One group of people wore masks and another group wore face shields. And it was the people with face shields who were ended up getting infected with COVID-19. And there's still a lot of debate in the scientific community about the difference between droplets, which are the larger molecules, and aerosols, which are the small molecules. And a face shield will do a lot to reduce droplet exposure, but for the aerosol exposure, my understanding is that a face shield allows so much openness on the side, the aerosols will get out and into the air anyway, and they don't offer significant protection.
So, I'm thinking that there's a few things that we'll be doing to follow up on today's conversation. But I'm going to ask, because I think the conversation here has been great, and I've been following the chat box with great interest, and I think we can also follow up with folks after today for some of the things that were raised here and some of the resources that were also shared. Really strong reminder that reading the regulation in the province that you are in is pretty important. I have spent quality time with the Ontario regulation, and I'll tell you the truth. I downloaded the PDF and I did a word search for the word singing. I did another word search for the word brass, just to make sure that I was covering off on all the areas that were likely to be touching on the work that we're doing. It's easy to find, it's relatively easy to read. We may not 100% agree with the mitigating measures that are currently recommended, but they are the requirement. Local public health authorities cannot be less cannot lower the requirements lower than what's in the provincial regulation. So I think it's important to know what's there and to start to plot out what we can do safely. The thing that I know as an avid amateur musician is that there's nothing that I want more to be back playing. But then I think I have an 82-year-old mom with a heart issue and assorted breathing challenges. There's certain things that I simply, however much I want to play, can't do them. And so it's just sort of balancing my desire to return to life as it was prior to the 12th of March and acknowledging that we're now in a very different zone. My love of music continues. My passion for orchestras to thrive remains unstinting. And we're going through a very delicate time now of adjusting, rebalancing, reprogramming, and great care. So, Chris, is there one sort of final philosophical thought that you'd like to leave us with in terms of sort of the obligation of care? Because I think, just in terms of, there's the rules, there's the regulations, there's the how to do it right, and then there's also just human beings. So what gets you out of bed in the morning? You'll need to unmute yourself.
I'm muted. Okay, there we go. You're more of an optimist than I am, I think, Catherine, because you asked what gets you out of bed in the morning, and I immediately was trying to compose an answer based on what keeps me awake at night. And as a production person, we focus on what's wrong with this picture is what we're most often thinking, whether we show it or not. We're always looking for the hazard. And that's part of why I'm really keen to be part of the audience for Janet's presentation on September 10th, because I feel like I do risk assessment every working day of my life, but I've never really formalized it. It just kind of, you know, I don't have a plan for breathing. It just happens. Risk assessment for someone in production is a little bit like that sometimes, because we're always trying to pay attention to what the next hazard is. So at the end of the day, we have to behave as a reasonable person would, given the circumstances. The circumstances are, we are either opening during a global pandemic or we're not. And that's the decision that every orchestra, every organization has to make. Once you've made that decision, all you can do is your best due diligence to try and protect your people and your business. And that may mean closing your business again because the revenue is not there to sustain you through this period of time. It may mean changing the way you work. Most of us are orchestras, we're not string quartets, but if the distancing regulations and the other things imposed upon us means we have to shift our business model to produce more smaller concerts with smaller groups of people, then that's the shift you need to make. That's all I've got right now, I'm afraid.
Okay, I think that's helpful, and whether it's what gets you out of bed in the morning or what prevents you from staying in bed at night, that, you know, it's just a matter of perspective. I'm going to just say a few words about Janet's presentation. And Janet has designed the session on the 10th of September a little differently than our usual run of webinars. So there will be a pretty intensive information sharing and expertise provided. But Janet is also going to be breaking you out into small groups to do a significant amount of work. So the session is actually a formal 2 hours and a bit, and then an open mic with Janet at the end. So it is a substantial chunk of time. If you're able to book off from 1 to 4 on the 10th of September and join us, that's the nature of the session. It's intended to be quite interactive. And I think if you, like me, find the notion of risk assessment something that we're kind of hoping somebody else will drill into the details on, Janet's warm, humane, and very practical approach will be a real gift. And I'm delighted that we've been able to secure her time and talent at a point when she is really in demand. So pretty thrilling stuff. So I think with no further ado, I'm going to, Chris, just let you know that there's a lot of love coming your way in the chat box, a lot of appreciation for the logic and the rigor of what you presented to us today. And just like to thank you again on behalf of a grateful population for sharing what you know and for continuing to do so through the production group, the regular Zoom calls, and the Facebook group. So Royden has posted the links to both the English and the French slide deck. We'll double check to make sure that some of the additional resources that have been recommended in the chat box and are added to our stuff, so that we're sharing the most current information with you. And thanks for being on board, everyone. It's been a terrific session, and thank you, Chris, for your generosity and care. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to seeing you
welcome.
very soon.